What if I told you that every sick crossover you've ever seen walks the razor's edge of basketball's rulebook? That Kyrie, Irving, James Harden, and basically every guard in the NBA today use techniques that would have looked foreign to officials back in the day? Here's the wild part. As interpretations evolved, particularly around the gather step that the NBA formally defined in 2019, what looked illegal decades ago often isn't today. We're breaking down the 7 levels of ball handlers, from guys who dribble like they're holding a live grenade to virtuosos who've mastered the art of working within modern rule interpretations. This is the story of how basketball's greatest artists push the boundaries of the rulebook, one ankle-breaking crossover at a time. The hot potato bouncers. Level 1 is where we meet the hot potato bouncers. You know these guys, 7-foot centers who catch the ball at the three-point line and immediately look around like they're holding a live grenade. Their entire body language screams panic, eyes darting left and right, searching for anyone to dump the ball to before something terrible happens. These dudes treat the basketball like it's radioactive material. The second that orange sphere touches their massive hands, their brain goes into emergency mode. Pass. Now, before anyone notices, you're not supposed to be out here, because back in the day, big men had one job: stay in the paint, grab rebounds, and don't embarrass yourself with the ball. You had centers whose entire offensive repertoire consisted of catching passes 2 feet from the basket and turning around for a hook shot. That was it. The three-point line might as well have been lava for these giants. Their coaches would literally draw up plays that kept them within 10 feet of the rim at all times. The few times these behemoths attempted to actually dribble the basketball, it looked like they were bouncing a medicine ball. Their massive hands would slap at the ball awkwardly, each bounce taking about 3 seconds to come back up. Watching a 7-footer try to take more than 2 dribbles was like watching a giraffe attempt breakdancing. Technically possible, but deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Here's the thing though, this was where basketball actually started, when the game still had rules that were enforced more strictly. Before modern gather language, footwork was taught and called more strictly, and space plus hand checking made creation harder. Every single dribble had to be deliberate and controlled. Every step was counted by officials who watched footwork closely. You caught the ball, you got your 2 steps, and that was it. Those 2 steps were taught as absolute and unforgiving, with zero room for interpretation. No negotiations, no gray areas, no superstar calls. But refs still call traveling today when players violate the gather plus 2 rule. These players established the foundation that every future generation would systematically push against. They played within the constraints of basketball's rulebook as it was taught and enforced in their era. Their handles were basic, sure, but they were completely legal for their time. Something that would evolve dramatically as the decades rolled on. The hot potato bouncers represent the last era when the NBA enforced its rules most strictly. When big men knew their role and stayed in their lane. When ball handling was a specialized skill that only guards were expected to master. When the phrase handling the rock meant something more than just not immediately turning it over. They were the final remnants of pure basketball before the league decided that entertainment value mattered more than rigid rule enforcement. Before officials started interpreting plays differently when players bent the laws of physics and the rulebook simultaneously. Little did these lumbering giants know, they were about to witness the greatest rule-bending revolution in sports history. They thought they were just playing basketball. They had no idea they were actually watching the systematic evolution of every principle the game was built on. The hot potato bouncers were the last players in a league that was about to change dramatically. But that rigid foundation they established would soon give way to players who mastered the art of pushing boundaries while technically staying within the lines. The get from A to B specialists. Enter level 2, the get from A to B specialists. These dudes had exactly one move in their entire arsenal, and everyone in the building knew exactly what was coming. You could literally set your watch to their signature go-to. But here's the wild part. It worked every single time anyway. Tim Hardaway perfected this approach with his UTEP crossover. This move was so predictable that opposing coaches would draw it up on their whiteboards during timeouts. Left to right, quick hesitation, boom, crossover. Every defender in the league knew it was coming. Hardaway would dribble up court, and you could see the defense setting up for what they knew was about to happen. Yet somehow, someway, ankles kept getting broken and defenders kept getting left in the dust. Chris Paul took the complete opposite approach, but landed in the same category. This dude mastered the art of manipulating the defense with as few dribbles as possible, using functional handles with minimal dribbles, maximum efficiency, and zero wasted motion. Paul would probe the defense with surgical precision, using just enough dribbles to dissect whatever scheme they threw at him. No flash, No unnecessary showboating, just pure basketball intelligence wrapped in technically sound ball handling that was incredibly effective despite not being flashy. Isaiah Thomas proved you could run an entire NBA offense with ultra-quick and aggressive ball handling, despite standing just 5'9" in a league full of giants. Thomas would attack bigger defenders relentlessly, using his low center of gravity and lightning-quick first step that was catalytic to team success, creating scoring opportunities that shouldn't have existed on paper. His handles weren't fancy, but they were effective enough to keep an entire team's offense flowing smoothly. Now here's where things get interesting. This is exactly where the rule bending started getting creative. These moves were still mostly within the boundaries of what officials were calling, but they were definitely pushing the limits of what refs had been allowing in previous decades. The specialists were testing the boundaries, seeing how much extra movement they could squeeze into their signature techniques. Defenders knew exactly what was coming every single possession, but they still couldn't stop it. That should have been the first major warning sign that something fundamental was shifting in how the game was being played and officiated. When a completely predictable move becomes unstoppable, the problem isn't the defense, it's the enforcement. The gather step was becoming more and more generous during this era. Referees were starting to give players the benefit of the doubt on borderline calls, especially when the moves looked smooth and under control. Officials were unconsciously rewarding technical skill, even when that skill involved stretching the traditional interpretation of traveling violations. These specialists perfected their one signature move precisely because they knew exactly how much they could get away with under the current officiating standards. They found the sweet spot between traditional fundamentals and creative interpretation, then lived there permanently. Every crossover, every hesitation, every step was calculated to maximize effectiveness while staying just inside the boundaries of what refs would allow. The get from A to B, specialists served as the bridge between old-school fundamental basketball and the rule-breaking revolution that was about to explode across the league. They kept one foot planted in traditional basketball principles while testing how far they could stretch the other foot into uncharted territory. The rulebook was still mostly intact during this era, but cracks were definitely starting to show. Officials were making more judgment calls and giving players more creative freedom with their footwork. What came next would force referees to make decisions about moves they'd never seen before. The fundamental technicians. Level 3 introduces us to the fundamental technicians, basketball wizards who operated in an era when their moves looked like actual magic. Bob Cousy earned the nickname Houdini of the hardwood. Back when a simple behind-the-back dribble made crowds gasp like they were watching someone pull a rabbit out of a hat. This was the 50s, when most players dribbled like they were bouncing a bowling ball. And here comes Cousy doing moves that made people genuinely wonder if he was cheating. His own college coach, Alvin "Doggy" Julian, actually limited Cousy's playing time because he disliked what he called Cousy's revolutionary razzle-dazzle style. Think about that. A coach benching his most talented player because the moves were too creative for traditional basketball. Cousy was performing techniques that weren't even in the coaching manuals yet. His behind-the-back dribbles and no-look passes had referees scratching their heads, trying to figure out if what they just witnessed was legal or if they needed to call something. The dude was so far ahead of his time that officials literally didn't have rules to cover half the stuff he was pulling off on the court. Steve Nash took this concept and turned it into an art form with his perpetual probe approach. Nash would bring the ball up court and start orchestrating the offense like he was conducting an orchestra, using his mastery of the pick and roll to dissect defenses with surgical precision. He'd dribble for 20 seconds straight, probing every single weakness, testing every angle, making defenders commit to movements that would open up the perfect scoring opportunity. By the time Nash actually made his move, he'd already manipulated the entire defensive scheme exactly where he wanted it. Nash wasn't just showing off, he was controlling entire possessions with mathematical precision. His pick-and-roll mastery demonstrated how you could manipulate an entire defensive scheme without technically breaking any rules, just bending them until they were barely recognizable. Then there's Pete Maravich, who basically revolutionized ball handling with moves so innovative that officials and coaches debated them. Pistol. Pete was doing circus-style dribbling routines that defied every fundamental principle coaches had been teaching for decades. His hot dog passes were considered outrageous by basketball purists of his era, who saw his flashy style as disrespectful to the game's traditional fundamentals. But his moves were so smooth and creative that they sparked endless debate about what should be allowed in basketball. Here's the thing, Maravich's techniques were so novel that refs and coaches constantly argued about them. He was taking the game in directions nobody had seen before, gathering the ball in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was explicitly taught, and performing behind-the-back moves that challenged conventional wisdom about proper ball handling. But everything looked so fluid and controlled that much of it was legal, even if it scandalized traditionalists. These fundamental technicians forced referees into making judgment calls on moves that weren't explicitly covered anywhere in the rulebook. The gather step was becoming increasingly flexible as officials tried their best to keep up with the creativity explosion happening right in front of them. They were making real-time decisions about what constituted legal ball handling in an era when the definition was rapidly evolving. The innovation was outpacing rule enforcement by decades. Every season brought new techniques that pushed the boundaries further, and officials were essentially writing new precedents every night. The fundamental technicians proved that creativity and entertainment value could trump strict rule interpretation. They established that if you made something look smooth enough and innovative enough, referees would find ways to let it slide. What came next would take this principle and turn it into an art form where individual signature moves became more important than the rulebook itself. The perfected one-trick ponies. Level 4 brings us to the perfected one-trick ponies, where individual players turned single signature moves into unstoppable weapons that forced the entire league to rewrite how basketball gets officiated. Allen Iverson's crossover was so legendary that it literally has its own Wikipedia page, despite the fact that most analysts only rank AI 7th all time in terms of overall ball handling ability. But here's the thing, nobody cared about rankings when Iverson was breaking ankles on live television. This dude mastered the art of creating his own shot completely unassisted, embodying the rise of isolation-heavy basketball where one player could take over entire possessions through pure individual skill. Iverson's legendary crossover on Michael Jordan is the perfect example of how he pushed the boundaries of what was possible. That move involved creative interpretations of what constitutes a legal gather, with footwork that lived right on the edge of what officials would allow. The move was so disrespectful and iconic that it transcended basketball rules and entered cultural legend status. His famous step-over on Tyronn Lue after draining a jumper became one of the most memorable moments in finals history. Pure theater that had nothing to do with the legality of his handle, but everything to do with his swagger. The move was so disrespectful that even Michael Jordan had to acknowledge its power, later joking to Iverson, "You don't love me, you lil b*ah. You wouldn't have crossed me up like that if you did." When MJ himself admits you got him, you know your move transcended basketball rules and entered cultural legend status. The crowd went insane, the highlight reels played it on repeat, and the referees just pretended they didn't see anything wrong. This era marked the exact moment when signature moves became more important than following the rulebook to the letter. Officials started making calls based on style points rather than technical violations. If your move looked iconic enough, referees would find ways to let it slide, even when the footwork was questionable at best. Derrick Rose perfected this approach with his signature in-and-out move that bent space and time with pure first-step explosion. Rose would hit defenders with a hesitation that seemed to freeze them in place, then accelerate past them like they were standing still. His footwork during these sequences was nostalgic perfection, even when it technically violated several movement rules that previous generations had been forced to follow. The perfected one-trick ponies figured out the ultimate cheat code. If you make a move iconic enough, referees simply won't call the travel. They discovered that entertainment value trumped rule enforcement every single time. Officials became reluctant to blow their whistles on moves that generated crowd reactions and highlight real moments. The gather step transformed from an actual rule into basically a suggestion during this era, especially for star players who had earned the benefit of the doubt through their reputation and highlight reel history. Referees started giving superstars extra steps and additional gathering time that role players would never receive in the same situations. These players essentially taught the NBA that highlight reels and crowd reactions generated more revenue than technical rule adherence. They proved that if you could make your violations look smooth enough and exciting enough, the league would find ways to accommodate your creativity rather than penalize it. The perfected one-trick ponies demonstrated that style could completely override substance in the eyes of officials. They established a dangerous precedent that iconic moves were more valuable than strict rule compliance. This era marked the beginning of the end for consistent traveling enforcement in professional basketball, setting the stage for what would become complete rule abandonment. The bag carriers. Level 5 brings us to the bag carriers, where individual players turned their entire skill set into an unstoppable arsenal that forced referees to completely abandon traditional rule enforcement. James Harden's step-back move spawned more travel debates than any technique in basketball history, and the league's response was basically a collective shrug. This dude perfected what former NBA officials call the 0-1-2 rhythm, or the waltz, a legal sequence that exists on the razor-thin margin between artistry and a traveling violation. Harden's step-back forced the league to formally define the gather step because his timing was so precise that officials couldn't tell where legal footwork ended and rule violations began. His move defied every principle of traditional basketball footwork, but it looked smooth and generated highlight reels, so officials decided to look the other way entirely. Luka Doncic mastered what can only be described as the art of deceleration, using bursts of speed followed by extreme, slow-motion control that puts defenders at a complete disadvantage during pick-and-roll situations. Luka's deceleration and timing live on the edge of the gather +2 window. His moves happen in deliberate slow motion, and his control is so perfect that his footwork stays legal within modern gather interpretations, even when it looks like he's taking extra steps. The change of pace is what makes it so effective. Defenders can't adjust to the tempo shifts, and Luka's handles flow so smoothly that what appears impossible is actually within the rules. Trae Young brought the nutmeg back to professional basketball, ending more careers than ACL injuries with moves that would make Pete Maravich genuinely jealous. Young's between-the-legs dribbles happen so fast and look so clean that defenders just stand there watching their dignity disappear between their own feet. His handles combine old-school creativity with modern rule-bending in ways that create highlight moments every possession. Ja Morant's explosive first step happens so fast that referees literally cannot count his steps in real time. The dude accelerates from 0 to full speed instantly, taking advantage of the fact that officials' eyes can't keep up with his footwork. Morant's handles aren't just quick, they're faster than human reaction time, which gives him a massive advantage in an era when traveling calls depend entirely on what refs can actually see happening. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander represents the new generation of ball handlers with moves so smooth they look computer-generated. His handles flow like water, combining traditional techniques with modern rule-bending in ways that seem impossible. Shai's footwork is so clean and his timing so perfect that even obvious travels look completely legal to the naked eye. Jamal Crawford turned over dribbling into an art form, with his tendency to bounce the ball like he gets paid per dribble rather than per possession. Crawford transforms routine possessions into personal highlight reels, using more dribbles in one sequence than entire teams used to employ in complete offensive sets. The bag carriers represent the complete abandonment of traditional traveling enforcement in professional basketball. They've forced the NBA to essentially ignore its own rulebook in favor of pure entertainment value. Officials now make calls based on how smooth a move looks, rather than whether it actually follows the written rules. The gather step has evolved from a simple two-step rule into what can only be described as the gather journey. These players take as many steps as they need to create their desired move, and referees just accept it as the new normal. But even the bag carriers were just setting the stage for players who would take rule bending to completely unprecedented levels. The Game Changers. Level 6 introduces the Game Changers, players who didn't just break rules. They forced the entire league to pretend those rules never existed in the first place. Jason Williams gave basketball fundamentalists heart attacks with his white chocolate flair that turned every possession into a circus performance. This dude was throwing no-look passes through defenders' legs and pulling off behind-the-back moves that violated every coaching manual ever written. Williams once revealed the dedication behind his signature elbow pass, admitting he practiced the move at least 30,000 times, but was only successful in games probably 3 times. That level of audacious commitment to stylistic innovation popularized flair and stretched coaching orthodoxy, forcing officials to evaluate moves they'd never seen before. Williams wasn't just showing off for the cameras, he was actively challenging decades of basketball fundamentals in real time. His flashy moves were so entertaining that they helped shift the culture of what was acceptable on an NBA court, proving that crowd-pleasing creativity could coexist with competitive basketball. The white chocolate effect spread like a virus through NBA officiating. Refs started giving players more creative freedom with their footwork, more generous interpretations of what constituted legal ball movement, and more benefit of the doubt on borderline calls. Williams single-handedly convinced an entire generation of officials that entertainment value mattered more than rule enforcement. Chris Paul took the complete opposite approach, but achieved the same result. He plays chess while everyone else plays checkers. Paul represents a blend of old-school Isaiah Thomas meets the new-school point guard, whose consistency and minimal turnover rate made his brand of functional, surgical rule. Bending exceptionally dangerous and difficult to officiate compared to sheer flash. His moves seem simple on the surface, but they push the boundaries of traditional basketball laws while looking so smooth that officials just accept them as legal. Paul proved that you didn't need Williams' flashy style to get away with rule violations. His surgical precision in bending the rulebook was actually more dangerous than obvious showboating because it normalized questionable techniques. Defenders and officials alike started accepting Paul's boundary-pushing moves as standard basketball, setting precedents that future players would exploit mercilessly. Stephen Curry revolutionized the game's geometry with smooth handles that made every kid think they could shoot from the logo. But here's what most people miss. Curry's handle plus his shooting gravity forces earlier pickup points and unusual traps. Defenders have to pick him up at distances that previous generations never worried about, fundamentally changing defensive strategy. Officials train on gather interpretations regardless of distance, but Curry's ability to shoot from anywhere forces defenses to play him differently than any player in history. His handles aren't just smooth. They're strategically designed to create the space he needs to launch from distances that rewrite what's considered a good shot. Curry's deep range forced referees to give him gathering time and steps that would never be allowed for traditional shots. His handles aren't just smooth. They're strategically designed to take advantage of the expanded gather rules that his shooting range created. The game changers didn't just bend basketball rules, they made the league abandon them entirely. Williams proved that flashy violations could override rule enforcement. Paul demonstrated that subtle rule bending was even more effective than obvious violations. And Curry showed that elite skills could literally rewrite the rulebook in real time. These three players established that iconic players deserve different treatment under the same rulebook, permanently altering how basketball gets officiated. But all of their innovations were just preparation for one player who would take rule bending to its absolute peak. The undisputed virtuoso. Level 7 brings us to the undisputed virtuoso himself, Kyrie Irving. This dude makes NBA defenders look like traffic cones, with handles so filthy they push the absolute limits of what's possible under modern rule interpretations. We're talking about a player who transformed ball handling from a fundamental skill into pure performance art that happens to take place during actual basketball games. Irving took everything that made previous generations special and somehow made it all better. He grabbed the composure of CP3, the herky-jerky movement of Jamal Crawford, and the flash of J. Will, then blended them into something that shouldn't be physically possible. The result is handles that look like they were generated by a computer program designed to break the laws of basketball physics. But here's what separates Irving from every other player we've discussed: his dedication to the craft borders on obsession. This dude is a legitimate gym rat who stays after practice working on 2 and 3 low dribble combinations, sometimes practicing 5 or 6 moves into a shot during his post-practice sessions. That impossible artistry you see on television isn't just natural talent. It's the product of relentless, specific work that most players would never attempt. Watching Irving's moves in slow motion reveals the true insanity of what he's pulling off on a nightly basis. Kyrie layers hangs, in-outs, and ambidextrous finishes so smoothly that clips look impossible, even when they're legal within modern gather interpretations. His sequences involve so many direction changes and body contortions that following his footwork requires frame-by-frame analysis. He maintains perfect ball control throughout sequences that seem to defy physics. It's like watching someone solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a unicycle blindfolded. Irving's footwork patterns look like choreographed dance moves that happen to end with basketball shots. Referees just stand there watching in complete amazement because even when moves are legal, they look like they shouldn't be possible. The undisputed virtuoso represents the final evolution of legalized cheating in professional basketball. Irving's handles are physically impossible under the original rules that governed basketball for its first several decades. His moves would have resulted in traveling violations on every single possession in any previous era of the sport. Irving has transformed the gather step from a simple 2-step rule into what can only be described as the gather symphony. He conducts an entire orchestra of rule violations with perfect rhythm and timing. Each possession becomes a masterclass in how to bend every fundamental principle of ball handling while maintaining the illusion of legal play. Every single move Irving makes would have been called traveling in previous basketball eras, but now officials just call it art. His crossovers involve footwork that should result in immediate whistles, yet referees treat his violations like museum pieces that deserve protection rather than punishment. Irving has single-handedly forced the NBA to pretend that both physics and their own rulebook simply don't exist when he has the basketball in his hands. Officials have essentially created a separate set of rules that apply exclusively to his handles because enforcing the actual rules would mean stopping the game every possession. The undisputed virtuoso stands as the culmination of decades of rule erosion and official surrender to entertainment value over technical accuracy. Irving represents the endpoint of a journey that began with basic ball handlers and ended with the complete abandonment of traveling enforcement in professional basketball. So what does all this mean for basketball today? From hot potato bouncers who treated basketballs like live grenades to Kyrie's physics-defying wizardry that makes defenders look like traffic cones, we just witnessed the complete systematic destruction of the traveling rule in professional basketball. The NBA didn't officially change their rules, they just stopped calling them entirely, turning every single possession into a potential highlight reel moment. Every sick crossover you've ever loved is technically illegal under the original rulebook, but that's exactly what makes modern basketball so beautiful to watch. If you made it this far, leave a like and let me know which level your handles fit into.